I found out my husband had been telling his family a lie for 6 years, and the worst part was that I had funded that lie myself every single month with my own paycheck. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just sat there at that dinner table holding a fork full of mashed potatoes, and I smiled at him. Because in that exact moment I understood something John never expected me to understand. He had just given me permission to take it all back. My name is Elizabeth Miller. I'm 45 years old, and until that Sunday dinner in March, I thought I knew exactly who my husband was. The dining room smelled like rosemary chicken, and the candles Margaret always insisted on lighting even for a regular family dinner. John's parents sat across from us, Frank at the head like he still ran something, Margaret beside him dabbing her mouth with a napkin after every bite. Diane, John's younger sister, was scrolling through her phone under the table, thinking nobody noticed. My phone buzzed in my lap. I glanced down and saw my mother's name. I stepped into the hallway to take it, my heart already tightening before she said a word. "Lizzie, it's your father," Linda said, her voice thin and careful, the way she always sounded when she didn't want to be a burden. "The doctor says the treatment worked, but the bills... Honey, we're short. I hate to even ask." "Don't apologize, Mom. I'll handle it." I walked back to the table with my chest still hollow from her voice. I sat down, cut into my chicken, and said it as casually as I could manage. "Hey, so my dad had a medical procedure. It went well, but there are some bills. I'm going to help them out this month." I didn't ask permission. I never had to before. In 6 years of marriage, John had never once questioned where my money went, because for 6 years it had always gone to his family, not mine. John set his fork down. Slowly. Deliberately. The kind of silence that tells you a storm is loading itself behind someone's eyes. "Your parents, your problem," he said. "Your money is yours. My money is mine." The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone already agrees with what was just said, and is simply waiting to see if you'll be foolish enough to argue. Margaret didn't look up from her plate, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch, approval barely disguised. Frank nodded once, like a judge confirming a verdict. Diane kept scrolling unbothered, like this was the most normal sentence in the world. Nobody defended me. Nobody even blinked. I looked at John's face, the face I had loved for 11 years, the face I had built a life around, and something inside me went very still, very clear, like water settling after you stop stirring it. Because here is what John didn't know I knew. Sitting there so pleased with his own logic, I had memorized every transfer, every payment, every just this once that turned into every month for the Miller family. Margaret and Frank's rent, quietly covered since the year they downsized and pretended it was by choice. Diane's car insurance paid without her ever once saying thank you. The electric bill in November when Frank refused to turn the heat down. The family trip to Florida 2 years ago, the one I paid for and wasn't invited to because John said it was just going to be family. $2,500. Every single month. Out of my account. For 6 years. Your money is yours. My money is mine. I picked my fork back up. I even smiled, the kind of smile people give when they've decided not to fight a battle in front of an audience that's already chosen sides. "Okay," I said simply. "That's fair." John visibly relaxed, satisfied that he'd won something. Margaret finally looked up, pleased the tension had passed. Diane put her phone down just long enough to ask if there was more chicken. Nobody at that table understood what had actually just happened. They thought the conversation was over. They thought I had backed down. I hadn't backed down. I had just been handed the exact rule I'd been waiting 6 years for someone to say out loud. I finished my dinner. I laughed at Frank's joke about the neighbor's dog. I helped Margaret clear the plates, rinsing them under warm water, while she chatted about her garden, completely unaware that she was chatting with a woman who had just quietly decided to stop being her bank. Driving home that night, John reached over and squeezed my hand on the console like nothing unusual had happened, like he hadn't just drawn a line in permanent ink. "Dinner was nice," he said. "It was," I answered, watching the streetlights slide across the windshield. I meant it, actually. It had been a very informative dinner. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I already knew what I was going to do. Not out of anger, not out of spite, out of arithmetic. If my money was mine and his money was his, then, for the first time in 6 years, I was finally going to follow the rules of our marriage exactly as written. John just had no idea yet that the rules applied both ways. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay next to John, listening to him breathe slow and untroubled, like a man who'd said something ordinary at dinner, instead of something that had just ended an arrangement he didn't even know existed. Around 1 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely, went downstairs to my home office and opened my laptop. I told myself I just wanted to look at the numbers. That was the polite version of what I was actually doing. I logged into my personal checking account, the one that had been mine since before we married, the one John had never once asked to see, because he assumed correctly that it wasn't his business. I pulled up 6 years of statements. Then I opened a spreadsheet because I am the kind of person who needs to see a thing in black and white before I let myself believe it. The transfers were all there, tidy and recurring, like a second mortgage I'd been paying on a house I didn't live in. $1,200 a month to Margaret and Frank, going back to the year they sold their place in Ohio and moved into that rental near us, the one John swore was temporary. $300 for Diane's car insurance, which I started covering after her divorce and never stopped because nobody ever told me to stop. Utility overages whenever Frank ran the air conditioning like it was free. A $4,000 roof repair 2 years ago that Margaret described to her book club as, "John really stepped up for us." The Florida trip, the dental work, the Christmas John got credit for being generous about using a card linked to an account he never funded. I did the math 3 times because I didn't trust myself the first 2. $2,500 and change every month for 6 years. Not a single dollar from John. Every transfer had my name on it, and every ounce of gratitude in that family had gone to him. I sat back in my chair and let that settle into my body the way cold water does, slow and complete. I thought about every time John had said, "Their family, Liz," whenever I hesitated, however briefly, about another request. I thought about the specific warmth in his voice when he defended his mother's spending, and the specific coldness in his voice at dinner that night when the subject was my own father. Your parents, your problem. Your money is yours. I want to be honest about something because this isn't a story about a woman who suddenly discovers she's a victim and dramatically throws a glass of wine. I wasn't angry in the way people expect anger to look. I was calm. Unnervingly calm, the way you get when a decision stops being emotional and becomes structural, like discovering a support beam in your house has been quietly rotting, and now you finally understand why the floor creaks. I picked up my phone and texted my financial advisor, Carol, a woman I trust more than most people in my life. I didn't call it was 1 in the morning, I just wrote, "Need to talk tomorrow about restructuring some automatic transfers. Nothing urgent, just ready to make a change." Carol responded within the hour because Carol never sleeps either. "Whenever works. Everything okay?" "Everything's about to be," I wrote back. The next morning I sat in Carol's office with my coffee going cold in my hand while she pulled up my accounts on her monitor. I told her I wanted every recurring transfer to the Miller family rent assistance insurance utilities, all of it canceled effective the 1st of next month. I also asked her to help me open a new account separate from anything John could see, specifically to help my own parents. Something clean, something honest, something that wasn't built on somebody else's rule. Carol didn't ask why. She's known me 11 years since before John, and she has a particular talent for reading a room without needing an explanation. She just typed, quietly confirmed the cancellations, and slid a piece of paper across the desk for my signature. "Done," she said. "These stop as of the 1st. I signed my name and felt something unclench in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. That afternoon, an email landed in my inbox with the subject line, "Recurring Payments Canceled Confirmation." I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and went about the rest of my day like it was any other Tuesday grocery store dry cleaning dinner with John, where he talked about a work meeting, and I nodded in all the right places. There was no argument. No confrontation, no dramatic announcement across the table. I didn't need one. John had already given me the exact words I needed free of charge in front of witnesses. "Your money is yours. My money is mine." I was simply the first person in that house willing to actually live by it. That night, lying in bed again, I thought about my father in his recliner, too proud to ask twice for help, and my mother's careful voice on the phone apologizing for a bill that wasn't her fault. I thought about how quickly I would help them now quietly without needing anyone's permission or approval, without having to defend it at a dinner table to people who had never once defended me. John rolled over and murmured something about being tired, then fell asleep within minutes. I lay there a while longer, staring at the ceiling, feeling strangely light for a woman who had just detonated something enormous in complete silence. He had no idea what he'd started. He still thought the conversation had ended at that dinner table. It hadn't ended. It had only just begun, and the first payment was due to disappear in exactly 19 days. The phone rang at 8:14 in the morning, and I already knew before I even looked at the screen exactly whose name would be sitting there. Margaret. I let it ring twice while I finished pouring my coffee, not out of cruelty, just out of habit. I've never liked answering a phone while my hands are full. When I finally picked up, her voice came through sharp and clipped, missing its usual sugary warmth entirely. Elizabeth, there's a problem with the rent transfer. It didn't come through this month. That's right, I said, keeping my voice even almost pleasant. I stopped it. There was a pause on the line, the kind where you can practically hear someone recalculating their entire understanding of a person. You stopped it, Elizabeth. We depend on that. Frank's pension doesn't cover the difference, you know that. I do know that, I said. But John was very clear the other night. My money is mine. I'm just following his rule. The silence that followed was longer this time, heavier. Margaret didn't have a response ready because in 6 years she had never once needed one. I told her I hoped they'd figure it out, wished her a good morning, and ended the call before she could recover enough to argue. I finished my coffee standing at the kitchen window watching a neighbor walk her dog, feeling strangely unbothered by my own composure. I'd expected to feel something bigger, triumph maybe, or guilt. Instead, I just felt clear, like a window that had finally been washed after years of grime. John came home from work that evening, already agitated his tie, loosened his jaw tight in a way I recognized from years of watching him absorb bad news, before he was ready to hand it off to someone else. My mother called me, he said, dropping his keys on the counter harder than necessary. She says you canceled the rent payment. I did. Elizabeth, what is wrong with you? You're punishing my family over one comment at dinner. I'm not punishing anyone, I said, turning to face him fully. You said your money is yours and my money is mine. I agreed. I'm simply keeping my money to myself the way you asked. That's different, he said quickly, the words leaving his mouth before he'd clearly thought them through. Different? How? He opened his mouth, then closed it. I watched him search for an answer the way you watch someone pat down their pockets for keys they suddenly aren't sure they brought. It's just they're my parents. It's not the same as some transaction. It wasn't a transaction when I was covering your sister's car insurance for 2 years either, I said quietly. But I don't remember you calling that different. He had no answer for that. For the first time in 11 years of marriage, I watched my husband stand in our kitchen with absolutely nothing to say, and something about that silence felt more honest than any conversation we'd had in a long time. His phone buzzed, then buzzed again. Diane's name lit up the screen, and he stepped into the living room to take it, his voice dropping into that low, placating tone he used whenever he was managing his sister's emotions instead of addressing them. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough insurance lapse cancellation notice, don't panic. Diane's car insurance was due, and for the first time since her divorce, nobody was quietly covering it. Frank called next later that night while John and I were getting ready for bed. I heard John's voice shift again, this time firmer, more defensive, the tone of a son trying to sound like an adult while still absorbing a scolding. Dad, I'll talk to her. Just give it a few days. A pause. No, I'm not going to let it slide. I said I'll handle it. He hung up and looked at me like he expected an apology. I offered none. I simply pulled back the covers and got into bed the same as any other night. Frank wants to talk to you directly, John said. He says he'll handle this like an adult. He's welcome to call me himself, I said, but nothing's going to change. I'm not reinstating anything. John sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, his shoulders hunched forward, staring at his phone like it might rearrange itself into a different conversation if he looked at it long enough. I watched him from where I lay, studying a man I had known for over a decade, watching him confront for the very first time the shape of a boundary instead of the comfort of assumption. I felt no urge to comfort him. I felt no urge to explain myself further. I had already explained myself perfectly in his own words, at his own dinner table in front of his own family. He finally set the phone face down on the nightstand and turned off the lamp, but I could tell from his breathing that he wasn't sleeping either. Somewhere in that darkness, I imagined him running numbers in his head for the first time in years. Numbers he had never once had to think about because I had always quietly handled them for him. 30 days. That's how long the leases and the insurance policies and the utility grace periods would hold before real consequences started landing on real doorsteps. 30 days before the family that had never once thanked me for anything would have to explain to themselves exactly how they'd been living for 6 years and at whose expense. I closed my eyes and let myself drift toward sleep, unbothered, steady patient. Whatever came next, I was finally ready for it. 30 days is a strange unit of time. It's short enough to feel like nothing when you're waiting for a vacation, and long enough to unravel an entire family's finances when the money that quietly held it together disappears without warning. By the end of that month, the consequences had stopped being phone calls and started being paperwork. Margaret and Frank received a formal late notice from their landlord, the kind with red print and a deadline instead of a polite reminder. Diane's insurance company sent a cancellation warning, giving her 10 days to pay in full or lose coverage entirely, which meant she also risked losing her ability to legally drive to the job she'd been complaining about for months. And a small family loan I'd been quietly covering for years, one Frank had taken out for a truck he needed for a landscaping business that never quite got off the ground, slipped into its first missed payment, triggering a call from the bank directly to him. I know all of this not because I was checking on them, but because they made absolutely sure I knew. Text messages, voicemails. One email from Diane with the subject line, "This isn't fair, Elizabeth." As if fairness had ever been part of the original arrangement. John called an emergency family meeting. At our house. His choice, not mine. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, filing into my living room like a delegation arriving to negotiate a surrender, except they seemed to believe I was the one who owed the apology. Margaret sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, her purse in her lap like armor. Frank stood near the fireplace with his arms crossed, jaw set in the particular way of a man rehearsing a speech he thinks will land harder if he doesn't sit down for it. Diane perched on the armchair, eyes red-rimmed, phone clutched in one hand like a life raft. Margaret spoke first, her voice trembling with something between hurt and accusation. "You knew we depended on that money, Elizabeth. You knew, and you just turned it off, like we don't matter." "No," I said, calm and even. "I was told my money was mine. I'm simply the first person in this family to actually believe it." Frank stepped in, his voice louder, more theatrical. "This isn't about some comment at dinner. This is about family loyalty. We've always treated you like one of our own." I almost laughed at that, but I didn't because laughing would have given the moment more heat than it deserved. Instead, I looked at him steadily. "Family loyalty," I repeated. Interesting choice of words considering my father was in the hospital last month, and nobody in this room asked how he was doing. Nobody had an answer for that either. Diane looked down at her phone. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. John, standing near the doorway, tried to slide into the role of peacemaker, the neutral mediator trying to calm two warring factions, except one of those factions was his own wife, and the other was people who had been living comfortably off her money for years. "Liz, come on. Can't we figure something out?" "Maybe not everything all at once, but..." "No," I said, simply cutting him off before the sentence could turn into a request dressed up as compromise. I walked to the drawer in the side table and pulled out a folder I had prepared days earlier, thick with 6 years of printed bank statements, highlighted and organized by category. I set it on the coffee table and opened it slowly, letting the room absorb what they were looking at. Rent assistance, car insurance, utility overages, the roof repair, the truck loan, the Florida trip. I read each line item aloud calmly without embellishment, letting the numbers speak for themselves. $2,500 a month for 6 years. That's just over $180,000. The room went completely silent. Margaret's hand drifted to her chest. Frank's arms uncrossed, and for the first time since he'd walked in, he looked less like a man delivering a verdict, and more like a man realizing he might be standing trial. Diane finally spoke, her voice small. "I didn't know it was that much." "None of you did," I said, "because none of you ever asked. You just assumed it would always be there." John stared at the folder like it belonged to a stranger, his face pale, his jaw working silently. I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, not yet. But the early stages of a man realizing the story he'd told himself about his own generosity was about to collapse in front of the very people he'd told it to. I closed the folder gently and looked around the room at each of them in turn. Margaret's stricken face, Frank's uncertain posture, Diane's quiet shame, and finally John still standing near the doorway like a man who suddenly wasn't sure which side of the room he belonged on. "There's one more thing," I said, my voice steady, unhurried. "You should probably ask John where he told you all this money was coming from." Every head in that room turned toward my husband at once, and for the first time in 6 years I watched the version of himself he'd built for his family start to come apart at the seams. Margaret turned toward her son slowly, the way people move when they already suspect the answer will hurt and are bracing themselves anyway. "John," she said carefully, "what does she mean, ask you?" John didn't answer right away. He stood there in the doorway of our living room, his hand gripping the frame like it was the only thing keeping him upright, and I watched 11 years of practiced charm fail him for the first time in front of an audience that actually mattered to him. "John." Frank said, his voice lower, now harder. "Where did you tell your mother this money was coming from?" I could have answered for him. I had the statements, the dates, the proof laid out in that folder on the coffee table. But I stayed quiet because some truths land harder when the person hiding them has to say it out loud themselves. "I told them it was from us," John finally said. "From our joint accounts. I said we were doing well, that I wanted to help out." "Us," I repeated softly. "There is no joint account for this, John. There never was. Every transfer came from my personal, checking the one I've had since before we married. You never contributed a single dollar to any of it." Margaret's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked almost like grief. The grief of realizing a story she'd told herself for years had never been true. "You told me you were taking care of us," she said to John, her voice cracking. "You said you were proud you could finally give back after everything we did raising you." "I wanted you to be proud of me," John said, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him, almost before I remembered exactly whose money had purchased that pride. Diane sat frozen in the armchair, her phone finally forgotten in her lap. "So, this whole time," she said slowly, "it wasn't John being generous. It was Elizabeth's money, and John was just taking credit for it." Nobody answered her because the silence in the room already had. I walked to the coffee table and opened the folder again, flipping to a specific page I had tabbed the night before. "Here," I said, pointing to a line from 3 years ago. "This was the roof repair. Margaret, you told your book club John really stepped up for you that year. I remember because you mentioned it at Easter." I looked up at her. "John was in Chicago for work that entire month. I paid the contractor directly. I have the invoice." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the folder, as if she needed to see it herself before she could fully believe it, even with her son standing 3 feet away confirming every word. The room had shifted completely now. What had walked in as righteous anger toward me had curdled into something far more uncomfortable, a family forced to look at the person they trusted most and realize he'd been quietly rewriting reality for years at his wife's expense for his own comfort. Margaret tried weakly to rebuild some version of the argument she'd come in with. "Well, regardless of where it came from, Elizabeth family is family. We're still your family. You should want to help." I looked at her steadily, keeping my voice gentle but very clear. And are my parents your family too, Margaret? Because when my father was in the hospital last month, nobody in this room asked how he was doing. Nobody sent a card. Nobody even remembered his name. She had no answer. Frank looked down at the carpet. Diane wiped her eyes, but this time I understood the tears weren't for me, and they weren't really for John either. They were for the sudden absence of a safety net she'd never had to think twice about before. John reached for my arm and gestured toward the kitchen, his voice low and urgent. "Can we talk privately?" I followed him mostly because I didn't want an audience for what I was about to say either. He closed the door partway behind us, his face tight with something between panic and humiliation. "You're making me look like a liar in front of my entire family," he said. "You are a liar, John. I'm just the reason it's visible now. That's not fair. I just wanted them to think well of me. You wanted them to think well of you using my money without my knowledge for 6 years," I said. "And when my own father needed help, you stood at that dinner table and told me in front of everyone that he wasn't your problem. You built your entire reputation with this family on my paycheck, John. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a choice you made over and over again." He didn't argue. He couldn't not with the folder still sitting open on the coffee table for anyone to walk past and see. I softened my voice not out of forgiveness, but because I still needed something from this moment beyond just being right. "If we're going to talk about money in this family from now on, it's going to be honest. All of it. No more stories, no more credit for things you didn't do. Everyone in that room deserves the truth, including you." He nodded slowly, his shoulders sinking, looking for the first time since I'd known him genuinely unsure of his footing. We walked back into the living room together, and I could feel every eye shift toward us, waiting to see whose side the next sentence would land on. I sat back down, folded my hands, and looked around at all of them. "If we're doing this," I said, "we're doing it properly. All the numbers out in the open with someone neutral in the room to keep it honest." Margaret opened her mouth to object, then looked at the folder, then at her son, and closed it again. I sent the invitations 2 days later, and I sent them the way I do everything now, calmly in writing, with no room for anyone to later claim they misunderstood the terms. 1 email to Margaret and Frank, 1 text to Diane, 1 phone call to my own parents where I gave them far more warning and far more comfort, because unlike John's family, mine had never once made me feel like an obligation. I also called Carol, my financial advisor, and asked her to join us, not as a favor, as a professional. If this family wanted to talk about money, we were going to talk about it with someone in the room who dealt in facts, not feelings. We met on a Sunday afternoon at a small conference room Carol arranged through her office neutral ground, no kitchen for anyone to storm off into, no couch cushions to grip like life preservers. Just a long table, water glasses, and enough daylight through the windows that nobody could hide in shadow. My parents arrived first. My father, Robert, walked in slower than he used to, leaning slightly on my mother's arm. But he wore his good sweater and shook Carol's hand like a man attending an important meeting, which in his own quiet way he understood this to be. My mother, Linda, sat close beside him, her hands folded in her lap, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, the way she always has. The contrast was immediate, and I don't think I was the only one who noticed it. Margaret and Frank arrived next, dressed more formally than the occasion required, as if formality might restore some authority they sensed slipping away. Diane came alone, quieter than I'd seen her in years, her phone left in her bag for once, instead of in her hand. John sat beside me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't try to fill the silence with charm. Carol opened her laptop and walked the room through 6 years of documentation, calmly, professionally, without editorializing. Rent contributions, insurance payments, utility overages, the roof, the truck loan, the trip nobody had thanked me for because nobody had known who to thank. She read numbers the way an accountant reads numbers, without judgment, which somehow made the judgment land harder than if I'd delivered it myself with tears in my eyes. Frank cleared his throat halfway through, trying to interject. "Look, we appreciate everything Elizabeth's done, we really do. We just think—" "Frank," Carol said gently but firmly, "I'd like to finish the summary first, and then there will be time for everyone to speak." He sat back, visibly unused to being redirected by anyone who wasn't his wife. When Carol finished, the room sat in a silence heavier than any argument. Even Margaret, who had spent a month insisting I was overreacting, looked down at the printed summary in front of her like it belonged to a different family, entirely, one far more dependent than she had ever allowed herself to admit. I spoke next, and I kept my voice even because I had rehearsed this in my head more times than I'd like to admit. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I said. "I'm here because for 6 years decisions were made about my money without my knowledge. Credit was taken that wasn't earned, and when my own parents needed help I was told they weren't anyone's concern but mine. That ends today. Not the relationship, the arrangement." Margaret's eyes glistened, but this time I sensed it wasn't performance. "We didn't know," she said quietly. "I believed my son." "I know," I said, and I meant it gently. "That's exactly the problem. You believed a story instead of asking a single question in 6 years." Frank, to his credit, was the first to say the words nobody else could manage. "We got comfortable," he said, staring at the table. Comfortable enough not to ask where it came from as long as it kept coming. Diane finally looked up, her voice small but honest. "I have to get a second job. I should have had one already. I just never thought I'd need one." I laid out the new terms plainly, the way Carol had taught me to lay out any agreement, clear, specific, nothing implied. No unconditional support going forward. No transfers without my direct knowledge and consent. No one deciding on my behalf what my family was worth compared to his. John sat through all of it without interrupting, and I watched something settle over his face that looked less like anger now, and more like a slow, uncomfortable arithmetic of his own. Not just the money he had lost credit for, but the quiet authority he had always assumed he held over how our finances and by extension our marriage would be run. Nobody clapped. Nobody hugged. This wasn't that kind of ending, and I never intended it to be. But when the meeting closed and everyone filed out into the parking lot, Margaret paused beside me for just a moment. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being more honest with us than my own son was." I nodded and let that be enough for now. John walked beside me to the car in silence, and somewhere in that silence I think we both understood the same truth without needing to say it aloud. The money had only ever been the surface of this. What he was actually losing was the version of control he'd never realized he'd been relying on. There's a particular kind of peace that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic music. It just settles in quietly, the way morning light fills a room you've kept the curtains closed on for too long. That's what the weeks after the family meeting felt like, not triumphant, not vindicated in some loud cinematic way, just quiet, clean, mine. I took part of what used to disappear every month into the Miller family's expenses and redirected it exactly where I'd always wanted it to go. I paid off the remainder of my father's medical bills in full. I hired a contractor to fix the sagging porch step my parents had been stepping around for 2 years, the one my mother always said she'd get to eventually. I even set aside enough to send them both on a small trip, nothing extravagant, just a few days at a lake house upstate. Because I realized somewhere along the way that I had spent 6 years funding other people's comfort and none of my parents' joy. My father cried when I told him about the porch. Not loudly, he's not a man who cries loudly, just a quiet welling in his eyes, as he sat in his recliner waving his hand like he was embarrassed by his own gratitude. "You don't have to do all this, Lizzie. We managed before." "I know you did," I said, sitting beside him, taking his hand. "But you shouldn't have to just manage. Not anymore. This isn't charity, Dad. This is love. I finally get to give it the way I always wanted to." He squeezed my hand and neither of us needed to say anything else. John tried in his own way to make things right. He apologized more than once, and I could tell some of it was genuine, buried somewhere under the panic of nearly losing something he'd taken for granted for over a decade. But I noticed something important in those apologies. He kept circling back to the consequences. His mother's disappointment, his sister's financial scramble, the awkwardness at family gatherings now. He rarely, if ever, circled back to the actual wound, the fact that he'd stood at our dinner table and dismissed my parents as a problem that wasn't his concern. I didn't rush to forgive him, and I didn't rush to punish him either. I've learned that revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply refusing to go back to how things were simply because someone finally apologized. I didn't file for divorce. Not yet. But I did something I should have done years earlier. I sat John down and laid out new terms for our marriage, the same way Carol had laid out numbers in that conference room, clear, specific, nothing implied. Separate accounts stayed separate. Major financial decisions required both of us out loud at the same table. No secret arrangements, no unspoken assumptions about whose family mattered more. And I told him plainly that we needed marriage counseling, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed to know if the man sitting across from me was capable of actually changing or simply capable of being sorry when caught. He agreed to all of it. Whether that agreement holds is still something time will answer, not me. Meanwhile, the Miller family adjusted the way people do when a safety net is finally removed, and they discover often to their own surprise that they're more capable than they thought. Margaret and Frank downsized further, moving into a smaller apartment that fit their actual pension instead of the inflated lifestyle 6 years of my money had quietly subsidized. Diane took a second job at a dental office 3 towns over, and the first time she called me, it wasn't to ask for anything, it was simply to tell me almost sheepishly that she'd made her first car payment entirely on her own. It felt strange, she admitted. Good strange. I told her I understood exactly what she meant. Nobody in that family calls me their emergency fund anymore. Nobody assumes. And strangely, in the space where resentment might have grown, instead, something a little more honest has started to take root. Conversations that don't automatically involve money boundaries, that don't require a folder of bank statements to enforce. A few nights ago, I sat at my parents' kitchen table for dinner, the small one with the wobbly leg my father refuses to let anyone fix because he says it has character. My mother made pot roast. My father told the same story about his fishing trip that he's told 100 times, and I laughed at it like it was the first because some things deserve that kindness. Halfway through dinner, my phone lit up on the table. John's name. Can we talk? I looked at it for a moment longer than I expected to, feeling the pull of 11 years of habit. Then I turned the phone face down and went back to my mother's pot roast, back to my father's story, back to the people who had never once made me feel like a burden or a transaction. He told me my money was mine, so I finally believed him. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know, where do you think this story goes from here? Do you think John can really change, or has too much already been broken? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.